Okay, so carrying on with this example of setting up our own custom class, implementing this in code, and then also creating this UML class diagram showing the things like the name, the fields, and the methods that we're using. I want to go ahead and add on to this now by also including the constructor for this. But something that you may have already noticed about this that might seem a little bit peculiar is that I have not yet made a constructor method anywhere in the code for this rectangle class. But if we look in the rectangle demo in this main method, I'm still making a call to this constructor even though one doesn't yet exist. And the reason that I'm able to do that is because of the fact that if I don't explicitly write out a constructor method in my code, then what's going to happen is that Java is just going to use its own sort of fallback mechanism, which is known as the default constructor. And the way that this is going to work is that essentially it's going to create an object of this particular class, and it's going to look at the fields that are provided and initialize them to some kind of default value. So to give you an example of this, if we have anything like these doubles or any kind of numeric values, those are going to be initialized to 0. If we provide something like, say, like a string or some kind of class or like an object inside of it, those would be set to null. If we have a boolean, that would be set to false initially, and just general things like that. Okay, so what I want to go ahead and do is, instead of relying on this default constructor that we're using right now, I want to instead go ahead and actually create my own explicit constructor so that I actually know what this is going to be doing rather than just relying on Java to kind of do it for me. Okay, so generally speaking, when we add a constructor to a code or to the code for a class, we want to put that at the start of all of our methods. So essentially it's going to be the first thing that we put right after all of our fields. Kind of goes in between the fields and all of the rest of the methods of our class. So just like the rest of our methods, when we make a constructor, we want to make sure that this is public so that it's accessible to all of the other classes that we might put it into. The next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to exclude the return type for this. And the reason for that is that whenever we make a constructor, it's already known before we've really started to write it that the constructor cannot possibly return anything. So we don't need to include a return method, not even or a return type, not even void for this. So the very next thing we're going to put is just going to be the name of the constructor. So the name that we give the constructor, if you look at what we're calling right here, you can see that what we put right here to call this constructor was actually just the name of the class. So when we provide a definition for this constructor right here, that's the same thing we're going to put, which is the name of the class. So we're going to call this public rectangle. We're then going to have our pair of parentheses, and then we're going to also include that pair of curly braces so we can start creating a body for this. So for this first explicit constructor that I want to make, I'm going to go ahead and put in a what's known as a no-args constructor, meaning that this is a constructor that doesn't take any arguments, so we don't put any parameters here, meaning it's just going to be an empty pair of parentheses, kind of like what we did for our get length, get width, and get area. Okay, and typically whenever you make a no-args constructor for this, you want to probably use this to just initialize the fields of this class to some kind of dummy value. So in the case of a rectangle, if we're going to create this and give it a length and a width, probably some appropriate values to provide for this would be like a length and width of 1. So just kind of some very simple default values for it. So we'll go ahead and put each of those here. So we're going to say that we want the length to be equal to 1.0, and we want the width to be equal to 1.0. So I'll save that. And then the other thing I want to go ahead and include in here, just so we can see that we're using this no-args constructor instead of the default constructor, now that we've added something kind of like that here, and we're still going to call it, I'm going to also include a print statement just to be able to show this briefly. So we're going to include, this is the noargs constructor. And then the expectation here now is that whenever we make a call to this constructor on line 5 in this program, we should expect to see this print statement being printed to the console because of that call to the constructor. Okay. The other thing I want to go ahead and do before we start setting the length and the width is to also just go ahead and take these two lines right here. I'm going to go ahead and copy those and paste them here. We'll save that so that then we can also see that the length and the width are both being set to 1. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and compile this code and run it as it is. So come over here. So we'll compile this code. Let's see, should still have it available right here. So compile that. We'll run that. And then we can see this print statement. This is the noargs constructor. We then have those two prints getting the length and the width before we start setting them. We then also still have the 10, 3, and 30 from those last 3 print statements from the prior setup for this this application. Okay. So the next thing I want to go ahead and do is actually create a second constructor for this. And for the second constructor, I'm going to change this a little bit. So as we can see right now, this first one that I created, this is the noargs constructor that doesn't take any values here. And so the second thing I want to make is going to be an additional constructor that actually does take some arguments. So this again will be public and then rectangle. Go ahead and have our pair of parentheses here. Then go ahead and create that pair of curly braces. And then right here, I'm going to go ahead and add in some parameters for this. So the parameters that I want to use for this one, I want to be able to actually set the length and the width based on some values that the user passes in. So I'm going to need 2 parameters for this. So it'll be 2 doubles, one for a new length and then one for a new width. So we'll do double new length and then double new width. Okay. And then whenever we go to set these values, it's basically just setting the length to whatever this new length is and the width to whatever this new width is. So it looks very similar to set length and set width. The 2 key differences is that we're going to set both of those values all at the same time within this one method. And the other key difference is that we're doing this whenever we first construct the object, whereas with set length and set width, this is usually done after we've already constructed the object, and we just want to be able to change the values later. So the idea is that this is used to initialize them to something that's a bit more useful than just zeros, and these 2 values are to change them or reassign them later on. Okay, so we're going to do our length. This is equal to the new length. And we're going to have our width, and this is equal to new width. All right, so go ahead and save that. And then taking a look at this right now, we've got a noargs constructor, and we've got the second one that has a couple of, is capable of taking some arguments. This one's going to be known as our parameterized constructor. So go ahead and add that here. So this is the parameterized constructor. Okay. So if we come back over here, so right now I'm making a call to the noargs constructor. We can tell because I didn't provide it any arguments. So I want to go ahead and change this by making a call to the parameterized constructor by actually passing in some values here. So for this one, we're going to give it some values. Since we did 5, 3, and 10 already, we'll go ahead and try some slightly different values. Let's say maybe we want the length initially to be something like 15. And we want the width to be something like 7. So I'll go ahead and save that. We'll then come back over to the terminal. So we can see right here, when I initially called it, we had this is the noargs constructor. So if I go ahead and compile this and run it, now we can see this is the parameterized constructor. So we can see now it's actually accessing a different method inside of the code for our class. And then of course we can also see instead of giving us 1 for the length and the width, now it's giving us the 15 and the 7 that we set it to within that parameterized constructor. Okay. And then the last thing I want to go ahead and do since we already saw a little bit about being able to use that default constructor, I want to take a moment to look and see what happens if I exclude this noargs constructor. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this entire thing out. So I'm just going to highlight it and just use a little keyboard shortcut in Sublime to go ahead and comment this out. Go ahead and save that. And then coming over here, I'm going to go ahead and remove this. So just delete that. So the test here is to see what happens if I try to essentially try to call the default constructor, or use this in such a way that I'm expecting the default constructor to be called, even though I have actually provided an explicit constructor right here in the code. So we'll go ahead and take a look and see what happens when I do that. So I'll go ahead and compile this. And we can actually see this giving us an error right here. So it's going to say constructor rectangle in class rectangle cannot be applied to given types. Basically what it's trying to tell me is that the arguments that it was expecting were not quite what I gave it. So right here it's going to say that we required 2 doubles. So that's telling us that what we required were these 2 doubles here for the length and the width. And then what I gave it, or what it found, was no arguments. That's what it sees in the actual call to the constructor. So those 2 things don't match up with one another. And the reason that we're running into this problem is that the default constructor will only ever be used if we don't give it any explicit constructor in the code itself. But if we do provide an explicit constructor, then we must use the constructor that's available to us. Okay. So of course then the easiest way to fix this is to just uncomment this, go ahead and save that, and now we have access to this noargs constructor, or this explicit noargs constructor that we provided. And so then right here, this is what's going to be accessed. So again, this would be similar to what we saw previously when I called that noargs constructor. So I'll go ahead and clear this, go ahead and compile this again, and now you can see that it compiles without any errors. And if I run it, then we'll just see it calling the noargs constructor and initializing the length and width to 1. Okay. So then the last thing I want to go ahead and do, now that we've seen the implementation of this, we'll also go ahead and take a look at how we would put this into our UML class diagram. So I'm going to go ahead and add this to it. So I'll delete what I already have, and we're going to go ahead and add these other 2 methods, these 2 different versions of the constructor. So the first one is the noargs constructor. So we're going to put a plus sign indicating this is public. We then put the name of the method. So in the case of a constructor method, that's just going to match with the name of the class itself. We have the empty pair of parentheses because it doesn't take any arguments. And then we don't actually provide anything after that. If we look again at the code itself, I mentioned before that we don't specify any kind of return type, not even void, when it comes to our constructor methods. And that's also going to be true in the UML class diagram. So we don't specify any return type for our constructor. So this is all we need for the noargs constructor. And then we'll go ahead and do another one. And this is going to be for the parameterized constructor. So we're going to do the new length. It's going to have a data type of double. We then have a comma, and then we specify new width, and then its data type as well. Go ahead and place that, and that's going to go right here. Okay. So now we can actually see all of the fields and methods related to the rectangle class. Okay, so we've got, the 2 fields, our length and our width, the data type, the indication that these are both going to be private. We've then got our methods. We've got our 2 different versions of our constructor, one that doesn't take any arguments, one that takes 2 arguments. We've got our 2 versions, or our 2 setters, or our 2 mutators, and then we've got our 3 different kinds of getter methods, get length and get width being kind of the accessors for this, and then get area being a way to do a calculation and provide some additional information about a rectangle object. Okay. So at this point, this is going to wrap up everything about constructors. This is also going to kind of wrap up this usage of this rectangle class. Going forward, I'm going to use a different example for the next concept that I want to discuss, which is somewhat related to the fact that we've created 2 different versions of our constructor, and that's going to be getting into what's known as method overloading.